Thank you for coming on the podcast. If you wouldn't mind, maybe just give the audience a quick overview of your professional journey so far.
Yeah, very nice to meet you as well. So, as you know, I'm currently working as the Chief Strategy Officer at Credibly. I run all of marketing and sales. I run the Tech Innovation Lab here, and I run the corporate strategy for the company. But prior to that, I spent almost 10 years in automotive, where I was part of Ford's marketing leadership program. So I did everything from long-term product launches in Brazil and Asia to selling cars to dealers. So very much across the board marketing and sales. That was right after I got my MBA. So I grew up originally on the East Coast and I moved to Michigan to be in automotive. And then before my MBA, I was working in human rights. So I've had quite a very different career path than many people, switched a lot of industries.
And what would you say is the biggest difference between working for Ford Motor Company and working for Credibly?
A great question. I mean, Ford, I think, came in at a time when, after my MBA, I really was switching from a small nonprofit kind of think tank where we were doing grants making, working in the social impact sector. So Ford was a really good training ground for me to experience the private sector. I had a lot of learnings around what are the standards, how do you do a launch, right? You're spending millions of dollars. My marketing budget for launching the Transit was like $95 million. So knowing how to manage a budget, knowing how to apply it to different types of media, but having a lot of structure and having a lot of guidance around how to take something that is maybe messy and making it professional. So I think those roles taught me a lot of critical thinking and also working with dealers who are very different type of animal, knowing how to work with different personality types, working cross functionally. And then incredibly is much smaller. It's in fintech. It moves a lot faster. There's a lot more appetite to take risks. And I think I left Ford at a time when I wanted truly a lot more autonomy. I wanted decision making to move faster. I wanted my own capabilities to be recognized in terms of being able to take something that has unit economics figured out and customer acquisition figured out, but taking it to that next level. So looking for more autonomy and ability to grow. And that was what Credibly was able to offer me.
I also understand that you're the youngest member of Credibly's C-suite. Could you talk about what cross-generational leadership means in the C-suite and some of the challenges or some of the perhaps hopeful signals that you're seeing there?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that I have been prepped on coming from Ford. So when I first got into Credibly, and still am, although I think that's going to change soon. But I was the youngest member of the C-suite, the only woman as well. Coming from Ford, that was also very much a reality in most of the jobs I was in. I was often surrounded by industry veterans who've been there 25, 30 years, car guys who grew up as engineers and really knew every piece of the vehicle. Whereas, I learned to drive when I moved to Michigan. So I grew up on the East Coast, never had to drive. And I was literally practicing like driving to work so that I could make it to work in one piece while making it in the automotive industry. So having to really challenge myself in terms of making sure that coming in very young, very junior, not really being a car person, how was I able to be successful at Ford? And so I kind of got a thick skin from that, right? Learning to work with dealers, learning to work in male dominated industries. In some ways, I think that really shaped my ability. I did a startup for a quick stint after I left Ford, which made me a lot more confident joining Credibly, that I didn't feel like I had to kind of pretend to be someone that I wasn't. I felt comfortable being my own skin. And I think one of the biggest things being a younger member in the C suite is two things. One, you're surrounded by people with more experience. And I think anytime that you have to manage or be in an environment where you're surrounded by people who have more industry experience, there's a question about how do you add value. And so, because you can't add value from what you know, but you can add value from the questions that you ask and the perspectives that you're bringing from outside the industry. And I think a lot of people tend to forget that that's actually very important for entering a company, is to bring that external perspective and also to ask the questions that maybe other people have forgotten how to ask. So that's one thing, right? And the other thing is also, I think, knowing how to create space for yourself. I often do a lot of sort of women's leadership. And one of the things that I tell them is, at the C suite level, no one is making space for you, right? You are not um, being asked about what your voice is. People are not trying to then say, well, how do I make sure that you are heard? How do I make sure that you're speaking up? That's something that happens when you're making room for middle management and coaching. But at the true leadership level, like you're fighting. If you have strong opinions and you're not speaking your mind, no one is going to go to bat for you except yourself. So you have to be very comfortable pushing back against strong opinions. Know that you're respected because you challenge people, and that you also have to be very comfortable being challenged. I think those are things that really separate um, being the C-suite as someone who is a little more junior than being like a middle management director. The level of confidence you have around speaking your mind and also knowing where you add value becomes much more important at that level.
Well said. You made me think of this kind of phenomenon where different knowledge can be valuable, but there's also this like antibody with in-group, out-group that often happens at like everything from school to business to regions, etc. Coming from a different industry, you said human rights into Ford after the MBA. You're in the automotive industry. You're learning to drive. Um, what degree do you think one should understand um, the product that they're selling? So, for example, I imagine you're not coming in as a mechanic or a race car driver. You're coming in as a unique value provider. However, just tribalism such as it is, people tend to say like, do you support this sports team? Do you know how to change oil? Do you know how to take apart and put back together an engine? Um, to what degree do you think is like appropriate for us as humans, us as colleagues, to understand like the what layer of detail should we understand our industry, or what layer of detail is it fair to expect that a colleague understands the product that you're selling?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I would answer it in two ways, right? Which is, I think that any good business with an open culture will give people who are new to the industry a chance to learn. So when I first came into Ford, I remember when I had to launch the Transit, and that was a commercial vehicle, which was very complex. It had, hundreds of combinations, and I used to pore over these super lengthy spreadsheets trying to remember like what axle ratio, matched with what roof height, matched with like what body length. And so that when I was going on tour, I could speak with like the truck drivers and the people who are in construction in a way that was at least baseline knowledgeable, or I just wouldn't earn their respect, right? If I didn't understand how they made their livelihood with a commercial vehicle and I was just coming off as some, like woman in marketing in the ivory tower talking about why they should buy this vehicle, then I'm not close enough to the customer to speak their language. So I would say that the first point of knowing the product is keeping the customer in mind and knowing that you have to know how to speak their language. I'm always directing my marketing counterparts, the marketing team I run, to say when you're running ads and when you're writing copy and content, you are not writing from the point of view of a marketer. You're writing from the point of view of what is the language that your customer would naturally speak in. Over time, that tends to get distorted more and more as you are no longer sort of sitting in that customer's shoe. So it has to be a very intentional um, reminder to always be speaking in the language of your customer. That's really the purpose of knowing the product. It's not just for your confidence; it's for speaking in the voice of the customer. The other thing I would answer is that in terms of knowing the product, I think that's great as foundational knowledge. As soon as you pass that, though, really in every sales job, you're really selling some version of a person, right? You're selling yourself as a person, you're selling your company, or you're selling the relationship that you're able to build. So you're selling trust, you're selling reliability, you're selling innovation. Those are really attributes of the product that you have to really keep in mind. At the end of the day, it's like you said, it's not really the mechanics, right? It's not so much what is the thing that you're actually selling. It's the job that the thing is trying to help you accomplish, and how much do you understand that job, and how much can you tell stories around that job. So whether it's an automotive, it's a commercial vehicle, and it's helping that plumber get to jobs faster, or it's in finance, it's in fintech, what I'm doing right now, where you're selling merchant cash advances or loans, and it's helping that small business owner get funding within 48 hours so they can expand their business. Like, that's the relationship and the human story. And that, I think, is common across all enterprises. So if you can remember, one, to speak in the voice and the language of the customer, and two, that like moving beyond product, what is it you're actually trying to sell? And it's usually a version of innovation, trust, reliability, and relationship. And if you can grasp onto that, then I think the product knowledge is simply a foundation for success.
That's a really interesting answer. It sounds like you're honing in on the skeleton key that you can take into a different industry or a different region. I kind of expected halfway through that answer that you were going in a direction, because Credibly is very different from Ford, and you seem to have this habit, which I admire, of coming in from the outside and learning the ropes and then leveling up. And then do you get bored once you've figured it out, let's say, or what's the driver to go from Ford into Credibly or FinTech?
Yeah. So I actually was working for someone at Ford who is currently the CFO at Credibly and is arguably one of the best leaders I've ever worked for. So he really brought me into Credibly. But you're right in that if I look at my past, though, I have always done the thing where I made these bigger switches, and on paper, I jumped from human rights and a nonprofit, much more government social impact work, to like a Fortune 50 company, to now like a small private enterprise. Very different business models, very different, and needs for capital and what it is that we were actually selling and providing services for. However, I think the one thing that really keeps in common is I really focus on who am I really serving in this space, and what am I learning. In terms of whether I get bored or not, I have always been able to create work for myself. And I don't know if it's like a skill set, but I started incredibly running marketing and sales and owning in P&L, which is something that I think is important to learn, to own like truly profit and loss models. And then eventually I sort of broadened my role into strategy, where I was able to touch tech and data science. And I brought in generative AI to the company. That's one of the main things that I'm working on right now, which is helping Credibly become a leader in fintech through generative AI, right? So like finding these business opportunities, making the pitch to top leadership, and then working on something new. I did the same thing at Ford, just like looking for opportunities within a certain context and then trying to pursue them. I'm not a startup person in that like I've done my own company. I've failed brilliantly at that and I've learned a lot. But I do think where I add a lot of value is taking something that's small, but has some legs, and knowing how to professionalize it. So understanding what stage of the business I'm adding the most value in, that's also really important. So of course, I think everybody gets bored once in a while, but I think being able to reinvent what you're doing, having a strategic point of view, what you want to do next. Some of my best employees will say this to me all the time. They'll be like, I have this vision of what I want to do with video, or what I want to do with social media or content. And I think that's great. I think that's when people really get beyond like, what am I doing on a day to day basis? And then
Uh,
being creative in terms of where they can bring their next, they can level themselves up. So that's what I encourage everyone to do.
Great. Um, I'd like to maybe take one step into the discomfort zone. Um, you brought up some interesting concepts with earlier when you said no one's going to make space for you in the C suite. And you have to kind of learn that balance with creating that space and the value for yourself, starting, like you said, with asking questions and finding ways to contribute value. Um, when I thought of what you shared, learning to drive, moving to Michigan, entering into the automotive industry, I don't know if you've seen the movie My Cousin Vinny by any chance.
Mm, I think I maybe a long time ago, but I definitely am familiar with the movie, but I don't recall a
Marissa
lot of the
Tomei
details.
has a brilliant performance. I believe she was not Oscar nominated and perhaps even won. And it's this kind of comedic, and yet there's a lot of truth in the judging someone, like judging a book by its cover, and then finding out that she knows more about cars than anyone in the courtroom. Um, and also the way she delivers the lines and stuff is
Yeah.
it's a non sequitur kind of. But I was thinking about pride and ego and how much it hurts to be rejected and to be not included in a group, especially one that you're trying to be included in. And there are a few things more motivating than that pain if you can harness it, like a neutron star. Like if you can channel that energy into studying, into figuring out a new way to break into a field. And I wonder if that's two sides to the coin, unpleasant though it is, if maybe not making space for people is a feature more than a bug. And I realize this is uncomfortable and there's ways in which it can go too far. But coming from human rights, going through the ropes as you have, or learning the ropes as you have, um, what are your thoughts on like should we um put out like padded kind of padding the corners and making things a little bit more open and gentle, or do you think that kind of breaking through is part of like a butterfly kind of has to struggle to break out of the pupa or whatever the term is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this will touch on a lot of fundamental beliefs that people have, right? And for me, I think it depends on what level you're at. And I kind of look at sort of how I raise my own kids as well, right? Which is the question I think is really to what level does friction and resilience play into growth and leadership? And the answer, frankly, is like always. And it's like, I mean, people do build character through adversity, and people become better when they overcome hard things. Now, this is there's a balance to it, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to be in a hostile or toxic environment and then tell people, well, you just keep working hard enough and you just suck it up and eventually it'll be fine. That's, I think, the other side of the coin. But there's a very important management theory around self-determination. And I think that if you and I was just looking at the other day because we were talking about generative AI in that context. And there's the center, which is self determination, which is sort of speaks to personal and professional happiness. And then there's three legs of the stool, right? There is your skills and your competence, there is your autonomy, and then there's relatedness. So when I think about managing um, employee satisfaction. And when I think about growth, usually where there's friction, it's around one of these three elements. So someone doesn't have the skills or competence. Okay, then you have to go get that. That requires that person to invest in some time to go gain those skills. You can't just complain about it and decide you don't want to do anything about it. It also, however, means that the company has to invest in that and also give feedback. A lot of people don't necessarily give the tough feedback early on in someone's career, and it creates this huge gap in their own perception versus how other people perceive them, which becomes a fundamental problem later down. So there's the sense of like, do you have the competence and the skills, and what are you willing to do to go get that, and are you getting the right feedback about that? Then the other thing is autonomy, and autonomy is really, do you have the right environment to support the kind of growth you want? Maybe this person, there are not some people are very good in structured environments, and that's what they need. If they get thrown into a white space environment, they just flounder and fail because they don't do well in those environments. And other people would rather cut off their left arm than work for a really large company because they don't want the layers and secure checks, and they want to be able to move really fast and take risks, right? So being able to be honest with yourself about what kind of environment that is. And then the last part is like that feeling of being serving a greater purpose, feeling like you're part of a team, but overall feeling like you are part of something greater, even if you can't articulate it. Those are all the drivers that I think make someone flourish as both professionally and personally. And us as leaders and us as managers is to make sure that we create that right balance. So it's not as simple as saying, do you offer nurture or do you make it so that people have to overcome things? I think you need to offer nurture in the right places, but you also need to make sure that people are able to believe they can do hard things and that they have to work hard and that they have to overcome certain things within themselves and also in their external environment. part of it is like you can't try not to be the thing that that person has to overcome, right? If you're a terrible manager and you're one of the problems they're trying to overcome, then you're part of the problem. So recognizing when you're a problem, but understanding that like business and life is all about problem solving. And so the more confidence you have and the more experience you have in solving all kinds of problems, internal, external, dealing with your insecurities, overcoming your own, what I call your own BS, right? Like overcompensating and not overcompensate, but like making sure that you can deal with that and overcoming those things. That is a necessary level of friction, and that's a necessary level to learn. And I think learning, which touches on like a whole like where we are with the state of AI, but learning about yourself, learning about the world and others, it requires a certain level of friction. So removing that layer is short-term gain, but long-term loss. But I think as a manager, facilitating that balance and being very intentional about it as a leader, like that's the hard.
Well said. It sounds like the main differentiator between a healthy and a toxic workplace is more how you do something than what you do. Um, would you maybe add any other kind of signs in terms of determining whether or not someone is within a healthy workplace, or perhaps one that needs some improvement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, um, to me, it comes down to really the kind of intention, right? Is someone being intentional in a way that is promoting you to grow, even if they're not perfect at it, right? Because people are generally, I find most people to actually be pretty good about forgiving little trespasses if they understand that you have their best interest in mind and you're only human, you're doing the best you can, versus being completely careless. And frankly, like it doesn't matter to them whether you succeed or fail. And you can see that in some of the key questions and how people answer them. So, one of the things that I always encourage people to kind of ask themselves and ask their leaders, right, is like, one of the things that my manager, one of my best managers, has ever asked me in a performance review was, is there anything that I am doing that you feel like is preventing you from growing to that next step? And I think that showcases a level of self-awareness that to me reflects on the kind of manager that she was. So being able to recognize that you yourself, the workplace, right, being an agent of the workplace and recognizing that you may be hindering someone else's success and being able to have an open conversation about that is very important. Another thing she did was she encouraged me to have a conversation with other people who was working for her with her not in the room, because she was so comfortable with saying this is the good, bad, and the ugly. And she felt very comfortable letting her people speak to her leadership and management style. To me, these are all signs of someone who is very self aware and confident in their leadership abilities. Even if that environment is not for you, having that level of self awareness delivers a kind of transparency and clarity that I think is very settling for people, right? They know what they're dealing with. Also, I think just seeing how people respond to conflict and how people respond to being challenged will give you a sense of, do people feel secure in that space where they can speak their minds and there's no backlash. If you witness people being very hesitating, a lot of side conversations, they're saying one thing to this person, but they're saying something else to you, or you're being warned of like, well, politically, you have to really think about this, then I think the question I would have is like, how much energy do you want to spend on a day to day addressing these like little gaps in like maybe small infractions and how that's going to be used against you versus solving actual organizational and business problems. And I would want my brain to be devoted towards most of my energy towards solving actual business problems than thinking about who am I going to maybe accidentally upset, piss off, right? And that, I think that's like once you make that mental shift, you'll realize how motivating it is. So the toxic environments, you spend a lot of energy in that second bucket, or you're just trying to like make sure that you can navigate the day without someone like lashing out at you. Whereas like a healthy environment, there's still healthy conflict, but people are talking to each other in a very open way. They communicate, they disagree, and then they part and they're fine. And I think
Mm,
like living through both of those, you
Mhm.
feel very different at the end of the day.
You brought up a term that I use. I mean, it's not like I coined it, but it's a term I like to use, the short term gain for the long term loss, or vice versa, depending on the use. I think healthy conflict is one of those things as well. If we're in like a people pleasing or like a sanitized environment to the extreme, perhaps things seem to be moving smoothly initially, but you don't actually, there's no trust. There's no foundation for trust. Whereas if you and I have had some disagreements, but we feel comfortable in the ability to disagree, when we do agree, that's going to have a stronger bonding agent attached to it because it's fostered or rooted in truth. Because I know that we have disagreed in the past, I find. And so there's like a short term loss, let's say, that initial conflict for a long term gain, versus the opposite, I find in I I imagine it's quite challenging kind of maintaining that balance because there are confounding variables and disruptors. But having like a North Star, like you mentioned, the psychological safety, you didn't use that term, but that's what came to mind as you described kind of the environment that one can voice their opinions without too much concern on how's this going to be perceived, or is my social credit score going to take a ding, as long as the net is positive in terms of our goal for this cycle or this sprint. Um, how do you look at this with like managing your team in terms of allowing people to disagree and like coming together at the end? Do you kind of look at this in like quarterly, or like do you have some kind of like OKR for your team in terms of cohesiveness and trust?
Yeah, I mean, the short version of the answer is like I do. I don't know that I quantitatively measure it, but I did actually. There's a training from Harvard, a business school simulation called climbing Mount Everest, and I always found it to be really useful. So I use
I
it
did that
with
as well.
some of yeah, I did with the management team here. And one of the major things when we go through the debrief is I tell people I have a whole write up because I facilitate all of them, and I tell them the number one predictor of high performing team is productive conflict, right? The ability of the team to have productive conflict, because a team that agrees with each other and maybe even like each other are not necessarily higher performing. So there's a difference between affective conflict, which is the bad kind of conflict, and productive conflict. So all of the building blocks that goes into productive conflict, like psychological safety, like trust, right, repeated interactions where the leader and the facilitator is then making space and at that level and helping each person speak up. There's many things, diversity of opinion, experience, like those things all come into play. Um, Having said that, I think when people default into their roles, it's very easy to self censor. It's very easy, even when I run these simulations and I see very clearly someone is self censoring, and I know the leader has not taken the step to draw that person out, and I have to coach them on, well, why didn't you do that later? Did you notice this person was sitting off to the side and not participating? So there's a few things I teach my teams to think about, right? One is like you can always delegate a conscientious objector and then you rotate that among different groups. So you teach everyone that it's okay to object and you actually give them specifically the role for them to challenge and object. So once you do that, not only is that accepted because people know that's to be expected, but everyone plays that role at some point. So it kind of puts everyone on equal ground. You never have that one person's like, oh, this person's always the naysayer, right? Like everybody gets to and expected to be the naysayer once in a while. The other thing which I think really makes a huge difference is I often get into, even with my marketing team, just like the other day, we got into a disagreement very openly. Sometimes the conflicts that come up are very public, very open, and it kind of bursts through. And you as a leader, you don't necessarily have the ability or the emotional discipline at that time to say, let's stop this conversation. This needs to be a one-on-one conversation. And sometimes it's not possible, right? You're trying to move a meeting agenda and you have a deadline. So you've got to talk things out, whether people are ready for it or not. But one of the things I always manage to say is like, if you notice the temperature going up, whatever happens at the end, always take a step back and appreciate people for the candid debate. And that's what I always say. I'm like, I understand this was a tough conversation and that we had some very open disagreements, but I want you to know I really do appreciate that people are outright challenging each other. Even if we don't agree, I think we always get to a better place. And just saying that, I think, makes people feel so much better about maybe having overstepped or not having done things perfectly. So to me, it's not really that I measure. I mean, we take team pulse surveys, and we measure people's, you know, how if they enjoy working here, they enjoy working for me, and I take the feedback pretty seriously. But it's in those moments where you are experiencing that conflict in real time and how you think about it, whether you send a note about it afterwards, whether you reflect in real time, and how you as a leader frame and contextualize that conflict for the rest of the team, they will remember that. And that helps, I think, create space for psychological safety and for further productive conflict
Mm,
versus shoving conflict into the corners and letting it
mm.
brew there where you have no visibility and no control.
Yeah, I think that that sounds really healthy. And of course, the market will prove it out. I guess in competition, which team performs better in the long run. If we could perhaps touch briefly on Uncurb, could you talk about what the kind of pain point was you were trying to address and what the experience is like in entrepreneurship? Because you clearly have a very impressive role within enterprise. And you mentioned that there's a challenge with entrepreneurship. And I just love to kind of understand a little bit more about what your experience was as an elite performer within enterprise in entrepreneurship. What would you do differently? Any kind of learnings that you can share with the audience?
Yeah, so when I left Ford, I had run a business there called Go Ride, which was medical transportation, where we were taking people to medical appointments. It was part of the mobility division. And then when I left, I decided to try to branch out on my own and create Uncurb, which was a platform for coordinating and organizing that type of transportation. It was at a time where mobility, was, and I think still is, a really big market. It was also at a time where there was a lot of competition in this space with dynamic routing and things like that. So it was also right before the pandemic. It was like the end of 2019 that I started this with my friend, who eventually moved to take care of his parents. So that kind of was a natural conclusion. I will say that if had I not had that experience, I probably wouldn't be the leader that I am today. And so I really looked at entrepreneurship. And to be fair, like, I will say maybe this experience is a little bit different. I don't know if it's because of my background or my risk tolerance, right? Like, I've always heard people say, like, when you go into entrepreneurship, you're sort of going like full faith, guns blazing, like 100% confident that you're going to change the world. Like, I was never that person, and I'm never going to be that person. Like, I am not. I'm too self-aware. I'm way too neurotic to be coming into anything with like 100% confidence. And it's just, I can't, I'm just not, right? Like, I know this about myself, and I just don't feel like pretending to be that person is going to be beneficial. I will say that that's a double-edged sword. So for me, I think it helped me have a lot more grounded and realistic conversations with investors. And I would never overpromise. I never said like, this is going to be the best thing ever. It's going to change the world. I was very concrete about like what I think I could deliver. Here's why I think I can deliver it. So those led to a lot of really good conversations where even though the business didn't work out, I think those connections had a lot of respect for what I had to say. On the other hand, I think, could I have been a little more bolder and not so shortchange myself in terms of what I was capable of? Maybe in hindsight, I think I could have been a little bit more confident. So those are things that I think you as an entrepreneur, you're always going to have a certain level of self-doubt because entrepreneurship at the end of the day is dealing with all kinds of your insecurities when you're not ready for them. Right? Because when you're in an environment where you are surrounded by a level and a structure where you have titles and offices and you're being compared against your peers, there's a lot of external signals to help validate what you think about yourself. And in entrepreneurship, all of those external support structures get removed. So a lot of times it's just you at night talking to yourself with no one to talk back at you. And so this is when you also kind of figure out not like who your friends are, but kind of asking questions about who is going to show up for me and in what way and why, right? And like sometimes people come out from unexpected places to encourage you or to put you down. But at the end of the day, it is tremendously lonely because you do have to have all of these conversations with yourself that you've deferred for a very long time. And to me, that's why I don't think I could do what I do today, where I'm taking an entire organization with a team of 36 and more, and I'm leveling the entire company up, right? And I've been recognized in my seat for doing that. But if I hadn't had those conversations with myself where I'm really honest about what I'm good at, what I was not good at, why was I good at this, and thinking about this aspirational version of myself that I want it to be, and then recognizing like I'm not this person, but I'm this other person. These are conversations you have with yourself for the rest of your life, but they pay real dividends in the choices you make in that next step. So I would encourage people, like, I think that to me is what entrepreneurship is. It's dealing with all of your insecurities on a timeline that you were not prepared for, but learning to have those really tough conversations with yourself, but also understanding that your answers to those conversations set you up for success, if not in this role, then in the next roles.
Very well said. I almost want to go to the extreme and say that everyone in business school has to simultaneously start their own company while they're in business school, because I think there's, like you mentioned, just that self-awareness and that distillation of like your motivation for doing things and your strengths, your weaknesses, how to apply them. Because you're clearly like entrepreneurial within the organization. Like your success is phenomenal. And so one might think like just plop that out and start your own company. It's same, but it's very different. The way you describe that sounds almost like, do you prefer to sleep in a hotel room or camping, like in a tent? And it's like different people maybe have different preferences. Um, and with Credibly, you mentioned using AI within the fintech industry. There's a lot of AI everywhere, and it's probably here to stay. But could you talk about how one can spot AI theater in companies? Because a lot of companies are branding themselves as an AI forward, and it's not very clear that they're using AI as thoroughly as perhaps they should.
Yeah. Well, I would say that we are, so to me, I think there's a few things. One is like no one is an AI expert. I have learned this and found this to be true in many different forums where people who are branding themselves, especially when they have like AI in their titles, I just find that to be like quite obnoxious, to be honest. Like it's just no one's an AI expert, and we're all learning this. Even the AI labs are still learning, right? Like most people don't know how these models actually work because they're black boxes. They're meant to be generated. There's only a few handful of people who even know how to build large language models. So the level of expertise and knowledge, like let's not all like let's just like settle it down a bit. Okay, let's say we're students and not experts. So for companies that I think are genuine AI users, like they are experimenting and learning themselves, and the conversations I have with people who really know what they're doing are very deep and conscientious, right? Because they recognize the potential. They also recognize the limitations. They understand what non-determinism, hallucinations, they understand AI does not have a mental model. They understand what a jagged edge is. They understand that like decoupling product from process is very tenuous at best. So typically for our whole lives, you work really hard at something, you put effort into it, you become better at it. This is starting to break down with generative AI in that you can now be a very elementary graphics designer or a decent writer or a decent artist or make music, and you never have to have training in it, right? You can write code without really understanding what the code means. So the ability to ask why all of a sudden becomes way more important. The companies that truly are not just wrappers around, like they're just not like a prompt that you wrap around a model, and they have real fundamental skills in terms of integration, the understanding of data, real understanding of how to apply AI, have usually the ones that I talk to are thinking and have thought very deeply and intentionally about how the human AI interface works. And are still figuring that out. Like I'm still figuring that out. I just deliver 3 modules of training to the managers, right? Talking about agentic commerce and human AI augmentation. And this is one area where thinking deeply about the complexities of AI, understanding that this decoupling can be very powerful, if applied to curious and tenacious learners, and very dangerous when applied to people who are just looking for shortcuts and convenience, and understanding how that distribution could look like in future society. We're all placing big bets, right? AI is going to sponsor system level change, not just tasks and job replacement, but really changes of entire systems and workflows. Those things take time because it's fundamentally not a tech problem. At the end of the day, it's a people problem. So I look for vendors and companies, and when we have good conversations, I look for companies that approach this both from a tech and a people problem. If they're just approaching it from a tech problem, usually not only is there a superficial level of understanding of AI, but it's often executed poorly. And I'll give you some great examples. I have looked at AI vendors who are like, you can replace your entire sales team. And I call this company and a real person picks up. And I'm like, so you are still using real people to sell your product, but you're telling me that I can replace my sales team. Like that doesn't work for me, right? Or if I ask you, what version of Claude are you building on? What's the version of the model? Why did you choose that model? Why Gemini, why are you using OpenAI 5.1 versus 4? And you don't have an answer for that, then like you don't think very deeply about the different levels of models that in the frontier models you're working with. And the other things we have to consider is also like, what are you really getting good at? If people are saying, well, I can use AI to do all of these things, are you just getting really good at like prompting different models to give you the answer, or are you actually getting better at the thing that you want to be better at, right? So like if I'm saying like I want to be a better writer, am I just really good at prompting different models to write better for me, or am I using it in a way that actually helps me be better? These are real conversations that we don't have a lot of good answers for, but certainly the companies that know what they're doing, they're not writing PR about it. They're not making these huge splashes about it. They're having very in-depth, conscientious conversations about how do I run human AI agents, right? What is an agent? What's the difference between an agent and a prompt, right? How do I chain these things together? Where am I putting human resources to once? Do I understand that AI doesn't have a mental model, which means I have to think about intelligence very differently? Those are, to me, the future questions that leaders have to answer. I just haven't seen a lot of great debate around that, which is why I keep going back to school. And I think that the people who think very conscientiously about it, those are going to be the companies that truly generate long-term value, not short-term splashes.
I like the way you put that, where it's a people problem, not an AI problem. And it sounds like it's not one size fits all. Like perhaps depending on the type of person, they should be using AI or should not be using AI in various ways. So perhaps the way you use it is not the way I should use it, for example. Are there any tasks that you think should never be fully automated? And where do humans add the most value after AI is deployed?
Yeah. Yeah. I think like people need to answer that as an individual and as an organization, right? So I can give you examples for tasks that fundamentally affect your identity. You have to be very careful of how you deploy AI. So my example would be I write fiction. It's a really big part of my identity outside of my work, right? And so I don't use AI to write my fiction. I use AI for business writing, for editing, for idea generation, for grammar checks, but I don't use it when I'm fundamentally trying to write a piece of fiction. Because as I said, it doesn't make me a better writer if I do it that way. Maybe my product will be better, but it doesn't make me a better writer. We're starting to see a lot of feedback now from software development where, a lot of managers are like, oh, AI writes like 50% of the code. Okay, sure, right? So are your developers better now? And what happens with the training? So now you have for junior developers, I'm sure it's a great assistant. For senior developers, now you're doing code reviews of like this machine that has like all the knowledge of how to write code. Is your work better? Because now you're looking at really complex code, which may not be really good, written by someone who doesn't really know what they're doing and can't think critically about it. So the question of asking why becomes more and more important. So to me, like knowing how AI impacts your identity and then breaking down the work stream to say, where can I add the most value? There's a framework that a Wharton professor kind of shared with us, which I was teaching to my team, Stefano Pantuni, who says AI is really good at data gathering and also data gathering and analysis, right? So quantity, right, and like preliminary analysis. But humans, so it's data gathering, it's recording and analysis is what it's called. But humans are really good at slicing and explanation. So humans are really good at determining what's important and then explaining causal relationships. So that's a great framework to think about how you're going to layer in AI with humans, right? So there's ways where you can use AI to free up capacity to look at funneling leads and then doing opening calls, but having humans do the actual really intensive sales process. Or you can think about it as AI is really good at gathering large quantities of data and providing analysis if you can, get it to not hallucinate, giving you the right information. But humans are good at identifying what's actually important in that piece of work and then being able to explain and teach and help other people understand the context and why it came to be. The asking of why, I have found, has been on the decline when people are using AI the wrong way. Just the other day, my husband was telling me he was doing a code review and he found this file that someone clearly wrote using AI. And the purpose of that piece of code was to disable certain features. And he was like, why? And the guy was like, well, because when I ran these tests, it only worked when these features were disabled. He's like, but you wrote the test. Like if you just wrote another piece of test, you don't need this file and the code will work. And they didn't ask why, right? And you can see this kind of lack of critical thinking, the not asking why being multiplied many, many times across. And as you deploy complex agents, it's even compounded. And so that to me is where you have to really think about where do you add in the human, who's asking why, and do you understand why you're doing things and why the AI is doing things a certain way versus just saying it just works. Because it works, it's great until it doesn't, and then you don't understand why. And that's a problem.
I'd like to ask you a few lightning round leadership questions that I think will be very good to get your perspective on. What is
Sure.
one metric you check weekly that tells you the truth?
Oh, wow. That tells me the truth. In my industry, I would say if it's on a non-people side, then I would check, I would say conversion, right? I look at conversion metrics. I care about customer acquisition costs. Like that's a really big thing that I do. If it's on more of the people side, I don't know that I have a metric, but I look at the number of one-on-ones that I have on my calendar because that's how I understand whether I'm connected with my employees or not.
You gave us a lot of gold nuggets on leadership and team development, but is there a belief with leadership that you've changed your mind on?
Yeah, I used to think very much about I think there's this concept of like servant leadership, which is like your role is to like serve others. And I really find that to not be true because I after a while it's not very motivating if all I'm doing is serving other people. So I really believe that leadership and management is a two-way street in that like you also have to be motivated by the people that you're working with. Right? It's not just about you making them better. It's also about the fact that like you get energy out of them making you better. And to me, once I pivoted from like my job is to make other people better and I'm doing everything I can to make them better. And then I'm just like, I don't know that I get so much satisfaction, right? But now I have the right high performers who also want to make me better and challenge me, and I feel so much more motivated managing the right people, not just anybody. So
What do people misunderstand about building inside of Fortune 10?
oh my gosh, that like that if you're not in someone's budget, it's not going to happen. Let's put it that way. Somebody has to put you in their budget. You can have the best idea and it's amazing. And if you're not a line item and an executive leader's budget, it's not happening.
And what is your personal definition of a high value product?
To me, a high value product is a product that people organically tell stories about without you having to prompt it.
Speaking of stories, you mentioned that you're a fiction writer. And obviously, to do that, you have to read as well, I'm sure. What is a book or essay that shaped how you think?
I mean, how cliche do you want me to get? I have so many things that I think are so cliche. I will say that recently I've been very turned on to one of my favorite writers has been Rilke. There's like a part of me where it's like before I discovered Rilke and after I discovered Rilke. And so I've always enjoyed Letters to a Young Poet, but even his selected poetry on the literary side, because I was a lit major at Harvard, some of the poems are just amazing. I would highly encourage people to check out. Go to the Limits of Your Longing, which is about sort of living all the terror and beauty of life. And then there's a poem called The Panther, which is about a panther he saw in Paris being trapped in this cage and how that animal felt. I just found to be very touching, sort of an explanation of when people feel like they're constrained by the wrong things and what that felt like. And I think everyone can relate to it, but it's written in such a like powerful way. I've actually sent it to some of the executive leaders here when they're feeling under a lot of pressure. So I've always enjoyed Rilke. I know it's a very cliche answer though. So
Great suggestion. If an operator is listening and wants to lead Gen AI transformation responsibly, what should they do in the next 30 days?
I think that you have to understand Gen AI is complex, and I think you have to go into it with a level of intention. I've always recommended people take a look at there's another theory by Ethan Mollick around this, right? Setting up your lab, your leadership, and your crowd. And so, what is your incubator to run moonshots and big projects? What is your crowd to get these little things going? And what is your strategy? But the number one thing in 30 days is to get people to be excited and not afraid of it, which means you have to give them tools, you have to give them some policy that they can work with, and just start to experiment. Because as soon as your organization feels good about the culture around Gen AI, that's when you can start building around it.
Well, you gave some really thought provoking answers. And I can tell that writing is a part of your passion because it was easy to follow along your train of thought. And I'd like to give the floor to you to share anything that we didn't touch on that you want to make sure it gets across. But before I do, where can people follow your work and what should they look out for next?
Um, I usually post on LinkedIn on my thoughts on AI. I'm also a fiction writer on Medium. But I am in the middle of this year. I hope to complete a book. I'm writing a series of letters to my children, just around things that I've like learned about life. So hopefully that is something that my publisher will work with me on. I'm not sure yet. I'm also procrastinating. In terms of what I haven't touched on, I think it's just I've been reflecting very deeply about this, and I would encourage people to think about this as well, whether from a personal or professional perspective, which is that as we enter this age where, like I said, the coupling between process and product starts to get weaker, we have to think very deeply about where are you offloading your cognitive thinking? Because the decisions you make and the decision your children make and your employees make about where they're offloading is going to come back and affect their journey towards purpose and meaning, which ultimately at some point everyone turns to around that. What is the purpose and meaning of my life? And why do I live? And for whom do I exist? And once people hit that point and they have not cognitively offloaded the right things, that the answers to those questions become much harder. It's not as important when you're in your 20s. It's much more important when you're 40s and 50s and older. And so those are things that I'm trying to think about right now, and I'm trying to help my employees think through. But I would encourage that even as a personal reflection, knowing where you are using AI, where you want to be convenient and where you want things to be friction, knowing that friction is what gives you the learning, that's a super important decision right now because the world is no longer going to make that decision for you. You have to make it for yourself.
MJ, thank you for talking to us today. Really fascinating.